The LA Clippers are easily the worst franchise in the NBA, it feels like at this point. I'm not going to lie to you guys. And with the recent news of sending Chris Paul home at 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a road trip where the Clippers are currently in Atlanta, this team cannot seem to get out of their own way. It felt like only a few days ago that James Harden, I might have been a few days ago that James Harden came off of their most recent loss from the Dallas Mavericks saying that there were real issues as far as where the Clippers were sitting. And I didn't know that it was any worse than just the losing. Obviously, they're 5-16 right now, is spiraling fast, but they're a team that nonetheless seemed as though they had enough adults in the room. Quite literally, they're nicknamed the Unction for a reason. Where you would think that the reasoning for Chris Paul being moved off of, or in this case sent home, would be for something a little less childish than what the news reported. The Both Lou Will and further reports from Chris Haynes afterwards stated that the reasoning for Chris Paul being sent home had a lot to do with tension within the locker room around him speaking up on things like getting back on defense, things that this team desperately needs to do given the fact that they're a bottom 10 defense so far this year, and they're not doing very much better on the offensive end to at least make up for it. But I kid you guys not. I was actually somehow, for the first time in a long time, because I tend to be asleep during these things, especially when the bombshells are happening at, 3 o'clock Eastern time. But I kid you not, I literally was awake for this one. I literally was awake for this one and wrote the article immediately. For those who are not, who don't believe me, here you go. Here you go. Hold on. You got it. There you go. My name right there. Right? This is one of the few publications I do actually write for. Um, and I was actually awake for this news. And I had to process it. I'm not going to lie to you guys. I wrote this article, I ate, and I went to sleep. And I told myself, maybe I'm tripping. Yes, I wrote the article. Yes, the news was clearly on Twitter. That's where I pulled a lot of the stuff from. Shout out to Chris Haynes. But there's no way the Clippers just did that. There's no way the Clippers just did that. And so I figured, okay, I take a nap, I wake back up, and maybe I imagined the whole thing. Maybe I imagined myself putting together an article for some breaking news that even ESPN didn't have a full-fledged article written for yet by the time that I had put this together. Maybe it was just one of those career breakthrough dreams that I was, that I tend to have every now and then for somebody that's trying to make it in journalism, right? No. Nope. Nope. The weirdest part about this whole thing with Chris Paul is that he's on a veteran minimum. He is easily your franchise's most impactful player. And you know, even if it's not treated as such by the rest of NBA media, it was implied after he announced a few days ago that this would be his last season, that this was a farewell tour essentially for him. Regardless of Ty Lue chose to play him significant minutes or not, that didn't really matter. The point was that Chris Paul would be in a position, and yes, this is a Clippers jersey. Yes, it's the number 3. Unfortunately, it's not Chris Paul, it's Quentin Richardson, but that's not the point. The point is, I wanted to get in the spirit of this to represent one of the GOATs of the NBA, man, because at least of the modern NBA, right? Um, and the thing is that when you think about the LA Clippers, right? I think a lot of people use the word cursed. I think the word I would use is incompetent. There's been way too many instances in which this type of thing has happened involving the LA Clippers where it just seems like they don't know how to get it right. Obviously, everybody is going to bombard them about the Paul George trade that has now built the Oklahoma City super team of super teams. And everybody has made their videos and written their articles about how the LA Clippers have now positioned the Oklahoma City Thunder to not only be a team that can run it back this season, but a team that can mess around and get a top 3 pick and push this thing even further into the future. But what about the ones that they were aware of that could have been handled differently? What about Blake Griffin, right? Blake Griffin signs a 5-year max extension and says to the media in the press conference that he wants to retire a Clipper. And within, what, a few weeks, I think it was, he was flipped to Detroit. Chris Paul comes back to LA. And essentially, if we're being honest, has been the most relevant, irrelevant thing about the LA Clippers over the last 2 to 3 weeks. Like, with the Clippers being as bad as they've been, the only thing positive to push about the Clippers over the last 2 weeks is seeing Chris Paul ride off into the sunset. Realistically, that was the only thing that people would even be probably tuning in to LA Clippers basketball for, was to see if Chris Paul will play. And I'm not saying you have to force him into the lineup. He played garbage minutes in that game against the Miami Heat. And I kept seeing a bunch of people in the comment section mentioning that he was released on December 3rd and his last shot cut the lead down to them only losing by 33, which I thought was like a kind of an interesting little nugget. Nothing that really matters in the grand scheme of things, but something that I think nonetheless still is kind of poetic in its own weird way. But the thing is, Chris Paul, just to kind of give my little little blurb on him real quick. Chris Paul is a representation of the point guard play style that I think unfortunately has not necessarily died within this NBA, because I believe that the floor general archetype is still one that has been able to thrive. Especially in today's league where ball movement is so much more impactful than isolation scoring compared to in years past. But he represents an archetype of guard that I don't think is ever going to be replicated again. The undersized, high upside facilitating guard that is one of the most dangerous mid-range shooters in NBA history, while also being a plus defender that made All-NBA defensive team multiple times. A player who literally has improved rosters everywhere he's went and has positioned some young players to reach the apexes of their career due to his tutelage, right? The Phoenix Suns weren't on anything before Chris Paul showed up. They showed glimpses of greatness with Devin Booker and DeAndre Ayton and stuff of that nature, but they really weren't on anything until Chris Paul showed up. The Oklahoma City Thunder, I'm not saying that Shai Gilgeous-Alexander doesn't get where he is right now without Chris Paul, but I think Shai Gilgeous-Alexander would credit a lot of Chris Paul's mentorship to helping him, at least in trying to get to this point where he is now. I think when you think about that Lob City Clippers team, and you think about what that meant in a space of time where there was a shift where the LA Lakers were no longer the cool kids in town, or at least you had to have a conversation about who the best team in LA was. And it started with that. It didn't start with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George and how all of a sudden once they showed up, there was this undefeated streak or significant lopsided streak in favor of the LA Clippers against the Lakers. It didn't start there. It started way beyond that. And it started with players like Chris Paul. This LA Clippers team, this LA Clippers organization just can't seem to get out of their own way. I saw something on Twitter that was from Lou Williams, who said he was essentially breaking his silence on the Run It Back podcast earlier today, and he was talking about how he honestly doesn't know whether or not you can trust the word of Lawrence Frank anymore, the GM for the LA Clippers. And that's because, there was a point where with him, it seemed like he was going to be a Clipper long term, and it seemed like he was guaranteed an opportunity not to, be traded, and, out of nowhere, within little to no time at all of a sudden he was an Atlanta Hawk. Again, essentially, right? And I just keep going down the list here and kind of running these scenarios through my head of like, you know, what? And honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around a lot of this too, right? Like, for a franchise that's going nowhere, for a franchise that's going nowhere fast at that, right? For a franchise that's banking on 2027, for a franchise that's banking on 2027 to right the ship, to figure things out, to get things back on the straight and narrow, I feel like Chris Paul was one of the only people. And excuse me for being so speechless, but I'm just honestly trying to make a lot of sense of this because, again, as far as I'm concerned, when I wrote the article for this, it kind of just came and went. It felt like a big piece of news, and I was like, I'm gonna lay down, I'm gonna wake up, and I'm gonna find out that I was tripping and Chris Paul is still an LA Clipper. And it's such a weird consideration now that there's a chance that we saw him go out in arguably one of the worst ways imaginable. You're getting DMPs as a legend. You find out at 3 a.m. that you no longer play for the team you essentially put on the map as far as the 2010s and really the 2000s in general are concerned. Let's take a second to really reflect on Chris Paul for a second. 12-time All-Star, 5-time assist champ, 6-time steals champ, 11-time All-NBA, made the All-Rookie team and was the Rookie of the Year in 2005, 2006, 9 All-Defensive teams, has won an All-Star MVP, and made the NBA Top 75 team. All at the right size of 6 foot. We will never see anything like Chris Paul again. That's the reality of what's sinking in. And don't get me wrong, I don't necessarily think that this means this is the end of Chris Paul. There's a lot of cap machination stuff that essentially has Chris Paul as just at the crib. He's not, he's not fully released. He hasn't said I'm stepping away from the game. There's a chance that he could be packaged as part of a trade and moved somewhere else, or there's a situation where they might have to do some things in order to get him waived a different way. So this is not a done deal right now. And I think that's another part of why I kind of just threw my hands up and went to sleep and said, I'll find out more when I wake up, because there's still so much more to this, especially because the Clippers still have more work to do to even make any sense of this. But the reality of the situation is that by making this move, the Clippers, I think, have severed any leftover optimism that any fan of the team could possibly have. They are really banking on that 2027 free agency class to work out in their favor. And the dangerous part about that is we have proof of concept that simply just waiting for the right free agency class to spark is a dangerous game to play. What's the most recent proof of concept? It actually involves the Clippers. The Clippers played hardball with Paul George before last season. Excuse me. The Clippers played hardball with Paul George before last season, believing that he would come back on a hometown discount. And the Philadelphia 76ers, who were lying in wait, were a team that had positioned themselves to go after a big fish, and it felt like, with everything going on, that Paul George had been that guy all along. Not only has that not benefited the Clippers, but it also has not come to fruition for the Philadelphia 76ers either, who are the ones that ended up spending the big money to land the big fish. All that to say that just because the Clippers are going to have significant draft cap, all that to say that just because the LA Clippers are going to have significant financial flexibility in 2027 does not mean that they're going to make good use of it. It doesn't guarantee that whoever they get is going to right the ship and turn things around. So this team has ruined their public reputation, positioned themselves to really have no future due to their lack of draft capital, ruined their perception around the actual NBA itself, as NBA executives have shown real fear in what's going to happen in Oklahoma City, facilitated by the LA Clippers, by the way. We talked about that last Routine Jumper Rant. And now you sever ties with your franchise legend in probably one of the most distasteful ways possible. I just named 5 straight things that would literally kill most franchises. You know, we always talk about the New Orleans Pelicans being one of those teams that like needs to be taken over by the league office because they can't seem to get out of their own way. Steve Ballmer makes way too much money. So there's no way, right? Obviously. But the Clippers just feel like one of those franchises. It goes back to something that I've said in the very beginning. You can't be cursed when you make incompetent decisions. Right? You can't be a cursed franchise when the reality of the situation is that your front office is constantly positioning yourself to be viewed as the bad guy. Your front office is always positioning themselves to make your team look like they don't know what they're doing. Your franchise is always positioning themselves where even when you make the right move, it ends up being the wrong move. You bring in Paul George with the expectation of getting Kawhi Leonard. You get Kawhi Leonard, and although it seemed like an all-worldly move at the time, you've been strong-armed by a superstar that hasn't played more than 65 games, really even that, in Lord knows how long. I mean, we can double-check it right now. Kawhi Leonard has not played more than 65 games I mean, do I need to zoom it in for you? Since joining the LA Clippers, he hasn't played more than 65 games outside of one season. One season. I mean, so you're strong-armed by Kawhi Leonard and Uncle Dennis. You got the scandal. By the way, the scandal stuff in relation to Kawhi Leonard, that was this season, by the way. That was at the top of this season. So you have so in one season alone, let's just talk about this year. The LA Clippers currently sit with a record of 5-16. You moved off of Norman Powell in favor of Bradley Beal, who is now injured for the rest of the season, by the way. Norman Powell, who you didn't want to pay a lucrative long-term contract for because you're positioning yourself for 2027, is absolutely balling out the same way he was for the Clippers in a Miami Heat jersey. You have a disgruntled James Harden, who now some are speculating may be on the trade block as a potential piece to help them get some real draft capital. Brook Lopez looks like an absolute shell of himself after looking like somebody that could be a solid backup center behind Ivica Zubac. Ivica Zubac has taken a step backwards as a defender so far this season, and I don't know whether or not to blame him or blame the Clippers' infrastructure around him because of the lack of defenders they have to support him as a rim protector. Then, Kawhi Leonard, who's only played 11 games this season and recently returned within the last 2 weeks, has not changed life at all this season and has positioned himself to look like a wash because despite the fact that he's averaging this 26.4 points per game, it hasn't led to wins. It hasn't led to wins. And you cap all of that off by the one thing you had left, the one little nugget you had, the one little feather in your cap you still had to make any level of positive regard around this season. You throw it away in the most discombobulated way humanly possible. I don't care how rich Steve Palm. Look. Let me make this very clear. This is how I'm gonna end this. I don't care how rich Steve Ballmer is. The LA Clippers to me are clearly the poverty franchise of the NBA, and it's not even close. Because no matter how much money they have, no matter how much money they throw at players, no matter how much talent they acquire, they can't seem to get out of their own way. They've hurt themselves for the better part of the last decade plus by simply making decisions that have done nothing but set them further back from even remotely being the kind of championship caliber team that we've had conversations about them potentially being over the last handful of years. The LA Clippers are a poverty franchise that can't seem to save themselves. And Chris Paul just became the next casualty for a team that's only going to get worse, and a team that's fan base is even closer to jumping ship if they haven't already. This team is screwed. And I honestly don't know what makes them any better anytime soon. That sucks. But you guys let me know in the comment section down below how you guys feel about the whole thing. Peace.